I had to leave my house because there's too many children making too much noise, too much screaming. So yeah, I found my little office space near where I live is nice and quiet. So I'm here, my white space.
Great. And you're actually able, not just you, but also your studio have been able to keep things going during this
Yes,
period.
very much so. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? The technology now allows us to communicate every day. We're still making things, you know, in gardens, in people's houses. It's very much, you know, business as usual. I mean, it's become harder, but it's, you know, we're very excited to carry on. You know, we've got to carry on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're going to get to the main topic of conversation a little bit later in the chat this morning, is Assemblage 6, which is entitled Unlearning. And I guess it's worth saying just at the outset that originally it was planned that that body of work would be shown in New York and also in Basel in May and then June, correct? So that has been delayed, but we're hoping to still see it in person later this year.
Yes, we're hoping for September. We'll see, you know, hopefully we can in September. If not, it'll be later on in the year.
Yeah, okay. So we'll get to that in a few minutes, and that's really exciting because that will be the first time that you, or I guess anybody, has discussed that work in public. So this is a
I haven't discussed it at all.
a great, an exciting opportunity to take the measure of what you and your team have done there. But I thought we might start out by talking about your career arc in a more general way. And I guess the first question I wanted to ask was just whether you could describe the scope of what you're doing in the studio and atelier, because it is indeed quite broad and has a lot of dimensions to it. So can you kind of quickly sketch that out for us?
Yes. I always describe myself as a greedy designer, you know, someone that really wants to be involved in as much as possible. I mean, it's a bit of an old concept, really, you know, everything from the door handles to the chair, to the table, to the bowl, to the coat, you know. For me, it's the whole holistic approach that I'm interested in. So it's everything. It's objects, furniture, clothing, and interiors.
So it's that old idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or the total work of art.
Yes. Yeah, we don't have a British word for that.
No, exactly.
No, actually, it's multidisciplinary, which I hate that word with a passion, but I haven't been able to come up with anything better. So.
Yeah, the German's definitely preferable. And in fact, when one goes into your studio in, is it Redchurch Street, is that right?
Yes, in Shoreditch in London, East London. Yeah.
So when one goes into your studio, you really feel that every aspect of that environment is really...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I set the studio up 10 years ago, I mean, I certainly didn't intend at that point that we would be making clothes, even furniture. It was very much multi-sensory experiences, really, installations and, you know, partial interiors, not permanent interiors. And so along the way, I've gathered what I call as the misfits, you know, the group of people that have worked either at an architect's firm or as an artist or as a fashion designer, graphic designer, sculptor. And they've got sort of frustrated working within their environments, doing the same thing over and over again. And I wanted to create a space where we could all just play, essentially. And it is, you feel that, you know, we have a fashion floor in our tool house, and we have a product floor, but actually everyone is working on different spaces and using different materials. And, you know, you'll get a coat being painted on one floor and then, you know, a clay bowl being made on another, and we're doing it all together.
How many people are in the studio at this point? I mean, within the studio itself?
Yeah, there's 18 of us. That's probably the biggest we've been, actually. And it's a comfortable size for me. You know, I wouldn't want too many more people at this point. I very much have contact with everything that we're doing, and that's really important to me.
Yeah. And of course, then you have a large number of external fabricators and collaborators beyond that core group of 18. Yeah. I suppose, yeah. Do you think that...
we tend to make the models and the maquettes or the toiles for the clothes. That's all made in-house, and then to actually manufacture it, we work with different manufacturers to create it, you know, in terms of production. So I am myself not a designer maker in that purest sense of the word, you know, in the way that some of my peers are, like Martina Gamper or Max Lam.
Right, right. I was going to ask you on that point whether you think that your previous experience in editorial work has had an influence on the way that you approach the studio, because it does seem like there's a strong element of editing
Yes, no, I think now I realise, yeah, essentially I kind of run it like a magazine. You know, there's kind of different departments, but we're all working on the same thing. And there's different, you know, there's different pages we've all got to get out, but actually it's, you know, there's an issue that's got to be produced, and we know what the theme is for that issue, and it's kind of, we're all on the same trajectory to create it. I think, yeah, it's true. It is run more like a magazine house in that sense.
And I suppose there's also some of the DNA taken from the fashion industry, because thinking about your entrepreneurial style, if I can put it that way, you have placed a lot of emphasis on these successive assemblages. And then, of
Yeah.
course, the garments that are produced by the studio also come out in a kind of seasonal rhythm, as one might expect.
Yeah, someone asked me once actually why they're called assemblages, and I think it was at the beginning when I started to make furniture, because I didn't train in design, so I always feel like the fraud in the room. I always feel like the person that didn't train, that doesn't really, didn't go to the RCA and didn't know what I was doing, and so I didn't call them collections because I didn't feel that it was kind of worthy of the word collection. So I call them assemblages because that's sort of what I feel I do. I kind of cut and paste and curate and edit and put things together. And I think having studied fine art and history of art, and particularly the history of art, all those references are there for me to kind of cut and paste and create those references all in one space.
Yeah, there's also always been a kind of emphasis on both the made and the found in your work. So there's a strong sense of receptivity to what might be around you and what's suggesting itself to you. And you also do work with what I would call a mood board, a kind of classic fashion methodology. That's been a big part of your practice as well.
Images. I always say I'd be much more comfortable having conversations with images than I would words. I'm not a wordsmith. So yeah, if we could have this conversation in images, I would be comfortable with that.
That's a good cue to start the PowerPoint, Lucy, if ever there was one. So let's in fact look at some images, because we have a lot to look at. So there's just one brief preview of one of the works from Assemblage 6, Unlearning, which we'll get to in a second. But let's look at some of the earlier pieces. Just if you could go through quickly, Lucy. There's a studio, of course, some of it. And then we had sort of organized these images around the theme of nature and the elements, because that seems to be a very strong theme in your work, and a kind of mystical overlay, perhaps. I wonder if you could speak about that.
There's three things that really are fundamental to me, and one is landscape. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, and essentially from a very early age I was kind of turfed out into the countryside, and could come back for tea at the end of the day. So I spent a huge amount of time collecting things, foraging, making sense of the world through nature. So nature and landscape is such a massive thing for me. Sculpture being a second, and then third, materials. And often that materiality, here you're presenting charcoal, has some basis in nature, or I'm using materials to create contrasts and kind of dichotomies. And so charcoal, will then quickly be followed by chalk, without the black. I need the white, and so there's always a kind of constant tension between the materials. But yeah, materiality is essential, really, to my work.
Yeah, and it's materiality both in the sense of literal materials, like the charcoal actually being present, and also the aesthetic or sensibility that's implied by that material. So they're sort of both indexical, real things, and they're also associative and suggestive materials.
Yeah.
Mm. A good example of that would be the way, for example, that you've used glass to evoke water, or this very specific material called cob, which is an earth composite, to speak about the earthly.
Yes, the glass pieces that we did, I'm very, right from an early age, I used to collect glass. So I had kind of obsessive collection of glass objects, whether that was glass spoons. I had a glass gun at one point. And so I had glass shelves with glass things on them. And at one point when I had kids, that didn't seem to make sense. But the these glass objects and the translucency of glass, I've always been obsessed with. And actually, when I got to work on these water pieces for the last assemblage, we worked with this Czechoslovakian place that was able to cast huge pieces of glass, crystal, barium, and the mass of glass that they can work with. The chair, for example, I think takes almost 6 months to cure. It's so huge. And every time we make it, we think it's going to crack. And then, opposite that is a cling film coat. Again, that translucency. So one of the first collections of fashion that we created, we didn't have the money to go to Italy and get yards of cashmere. So we were making things out of bin liners and cling film and aluminium foil and artist canvas. So really, really primal materials that we could, ubiquitous materials that we could find.
So that was actually partly prompted by a kind of ad hoc contingency of just whatever laid to hand materials that were expensive.
Exactly. Things that didn't cost much, that we could easily get hold of, that we'd be able to easily reproduce. But for me, they have equal importance, whether it's the amazing crystal or the cling film. Somehow they're fine.
That's interesting because it implies that there's a value that's active in the design practice that's quite disengaged from the inherent value of the materials, because obviously the lithium crystal is very expensive and the cling film not so much. So
it's not related to the beauty of it is not related to its value in that sense. Having moved several times, it's amazing the things that I keep and the things that I throw away, and somehow the things that I keep, they're not design classics or expensive bits of art. It's always things that I've found that have inherent meaning to them, and I'm always trying to find how can you recreate that in something. What is it that draws you to a natural object? What is it that makes it so special and makes you want to keep it? And so I was trying to evaluate that, really.
Yeah, so the act of selection can be just as intensive as the act of making.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's also very interesting if you're just thinking art historically, because when Duchamp first introduced the ready-made to art history, there was a very strong sense that was an anti-aesthetic move.
Yeah.
But obviously at this point we can experience it as an equally aestheticizing act to choose something, whether it's a beach stone or a piece of rubbish, right? So it seems like you're really engaging in that kind of art historical dialogue as well. And I suppose that'll come up more explicitly when we get to assemblage 6. But it does seem like something that runs through your whole career, that idea of very, very strong, resonant aesthetic response to things that suggest themselves to you.
Yeah, I guess in my head, it's like a sort of back catalogue of references and images. And I certainly noticed, having worked with, proper designers in my studio, guys that have come from the RCA, there's a cut-off point in their education. And I don't know if that is the way it is in the schools at the moment, but anything from really 1910, 1900 at push, they don't really have any books or any references back from that point. Whereas for me, that was an essential part of my education. So when people look at the roly-poly chair, some people say, wow, I see an African stool. Other people say they see an Art Deco movement piece of furniture. Some people see something 60s within it. And probably actually it's all there. It's all kind of, a mashup of all of those.
Yeah, and also rustic historical furniture as well, of course, that again might be totally off the radar of most other designers.
Yeah.
Let's look at one of the interiors that you've done, the Mulberry Store concept, because interiors have been a big part of what you've been working on, in addition to objects, in addition to garments. Can you talk about that as a sort of separate channel in your work?
Yeah, interiors is really where I started. So after I graduated in fine art and history of art, I got my first job at Condé Nast and worked as the interiors editor there at the World of Interiors magazine. And that was a great starting point, a great education for someone that's 21 and is just hungry for knowledge. And I was handling amazing 18th century teapots and heading off to Mali to look at mud huts and Rajasthani palaces and 16th century Windsor chairs. That was all part of that education, and interiors were, creating spaces was my starting point. So interiors have always been important in my work, and even within, when I'm presenting objects, the space that I create is as important as the objects. And Mulberry is one of the most recent projects that we worked on, and probably the biggest, largest scale commercial project that we've worked on. So it's their flagship store on Regent Street. And yes, they wanted to embrace their British heritage, and I wanted to create a kind of brutalist mixed with British landscape, brutal building mixed with a British landscape. And so, yeah, we tried to push the materiality within the interiors to go beyond what would normally be expected of a retail environment. And so, there's not the traditional shelving. We've made, our own product displays, and we've used things like tiles throughout for the flooring, and hand-painted walls to create the landscape. So I think it was definitely a push on from their normal retail environment.
Can I ask you a question, Faye, about Britishness? I certainly experience you. I lived in Britain for 8 years, but I'm not British myself. But I certainly experience you as being somehow an exemplary British designer. And it's interesting to hear you talk about even brutalism as being a kind of British motif, thinking about Barbican or Hayward Gallery. Yeah. Is this something that you think about consciously as you're setting about your work? Do you think about national style or trajectories? No. I mean, it's just inherent, it's imbued in me, it's inherent, but yes, it's interesting. People talk about my Britishness, but it's not, it's just the way I see things, the way I feel, and the work is put together. It's not conscious in that sense. So you feel like it's more the air you breathe rather than trying to do justice to a specific trajectory that you're inheriting then?
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. I suppose there's an interesting thing there too about, if we think about brutalism as both being in some ways the apex of a certain type of modernism, and that being a very international style. We have it here in America, it exists in Africa, it exists in Bangladesh, it's everywhere. And yet at the same time, it can also be something quite lived in, thinking about the Barbican as a place that you go again and again, so there's a kind of interesting dichotomy there, perhaps, about something that is, a kind of formal language that aspires to transcend place and time and be sort of honest and true, and yet something that can also be like an old shoe.
Absolutely, completely old knackered shoe. Yeah, I mean, British characters, British people, British buildings, there's something that, it's very difficult to put your hand on what it is that makes something British. But there is that sense of there's a sense of a kind of deep understanding of heritage, but at the same time being able to play with it and disregard it, and stick two fingers up at it, and also laugh at it. And I think Britishness is kind of, there's a humour there. There's a sense of joy, and that's a really big part of, I think, my work as well. There's, sort of being brave, being joyful, kind of having that childlike aspect about it. I think somehow that is in that British character.
Yeah, that's very striking in this image that we're looking at now. So you have this cabinet that, at least to me, suggests that it's kind of moved on from the roly-poly, the lines of the roly-poly chair.
Why do they have two fat legs? Because it looks kind of odd. Yeah.
Yeah, but it feels like a space that's at once very, not austere exactly, but has a kind of sobriety to it, but it's also very comfortable and does have that kind of childlike note to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Let's go on to the images of assemblage 5, if we could. So this is the last show that you had at Friedman Benda a couple of years ago now, and this very much carries on the theme of the elements and kind of natural cycles. And I can't help but mention, Faye, that you have images of the moon behind you as we're speaking as well. So
Well, I had to put something up because otherwise
It was appropriately cosmic.
yeah, my cosmic world.
But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the source of inspiration for this body of work, and also sort of how you thought it landed in the gallery, because it was a very complicated, multivalent set of research projects that you were doing into different materials, and then seeing them kind of come all together must have been quite an experience. But can you talk a little bit about what the component parts of it were?
Yeah, so the starting point really was that Le Corbusier's chapel in the south of France. I'd visited this place Matisse's chapel, in the south of France, and I visited this place not really knowing much about it, and you know, I hadn't kind of got any preconceptions of it, and I had such a emotional response to it. It's one of those buildings, you know, you get that with music, or you get that with a piece of art or something, you know, literally tugged somewhere at my emotions, and I just stood there and couldn't believe what Matisse had done to this place. And he'd worked on the overall environment, some beautiful tiles, the stained glass, the robes that were worn in the chapel. It was just a complete work, and so successfully done. And so you may not see that within this work immediately, but that was the starting point behind this. And there's earth, moon, and water represented here in the pieces. So the roly-poly, for example, was created out of bronze with a silver nitrate finish to represent the moon, and then the solid crystal piece to represent water. And then in order to create the earth, the cob composite was made, you know, much like cob houses. This is like a cob composite. So to create mud furniture was a challenge, but we got it after many cracked piees.
Say a little bit more about what's in there. Is it literally mud and straw? Is that what goes into cob composite?
It's a combination of mud and obviously the resin to hold it together.
Right.
And you know, and an aggregate basically.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, let's go through some of the images of the objects there, Lucy. So here we see some of the cob pieces, for example, and the lines of the forms have that kind of giving, generous, volumetric quality. Not just the roly-poly chair, but also many of the other forms that you were working with.
Yeah, so following on from roly-poly, the kind of the fuller, fatter, plumper form was something I was definitely exploring, and those kind of heavy legs to that table.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think that there was a conscious, here we see the cob roly-poly, do you think that there was a conscious effort here on your part to make work that was, I don't know if this is the right word, but I want to use the word friendly, like, or accessible maybe?
No, not conscious. Not conscious. It's interesting. I mean, I don't know. The roly-poly came after having my first child, and before that, I'd made a lot of steel pieces, a lot of hard lines, a lot of angular, you know, a lot of angular geometry going on. And yeah, for sure, becoming a mother, you know, created things like the spoon chair and the roly-poly chair. You know, there's a softer line there.
Yeah. But also you were looking, and the spoon chair is a great example of it, as is this game, you were looking at African sources for the furniture as well. Is that right? So yeah, a kind of reshuffling of the deck of influences. Yeah. Do you think that the materials are ones that will stay with you now? I mean, is cob something you want to continue thinking about?
Very much so. In fact, I'm looking at it at the moment, and looking at the colours that I can get from it. So we're looking at putting pigment through it and what colours we can get through that. So yeah, these are the reason I think I went to, you know, for these materials, is this is the kind of the backbone of, you know, what I'm about. You know, it's kind of, yeah, mud, the moon, and some water, and I'm happy. You know, it's the kind of the raw, essential, elementary ingredients.
Yeah, so there's something quite primary and
Exactly, primal is the word for this collection. Yeah.
Although this to me also suggests another dichotomy, because at the same time that there's that primal splashing around in the swamp kind of quality, or the marsh, there's also a very strong sense of ritual, and the fact that it began from Matisse, and that you also have these tapestries on the wall that suggest ecclesiastical garments like chasubles.
Exactly, the ecclesiastical garments, the rosary beads, you know, the kind of the sense of offering on the altar table. Yeah,
or even these shelves, which suggest a very kind of specific encoded arrangement of abstract form. And I guess one thing that struck me very much about the show was that there was a kind of elastic relationship between the primary cues that the materials and forms were giving me, and also this very intense ritualistic quality that was somewhat mysterious. Obviously, the idea of engaging with earth, water, and the moon also suggested that. And it made me wonder about everyday rituals that maybe we don't subscribe to as much as we used to historically, and whether you were trying to find a way of restoring that or giving that back to people.
I think the sense of ritual is really important. I mean, I'm sure at the moment everyone is completely analysing that in their life. You know, we have to get up and we get through the day, and we're repeating that same day over and over again with very limited resources or outlets. And so actually, it's, you know, ritual is fundamental to human beings. You know, without it, we're kind of lost. And I think there's different. We were talking about it earlier, actually, but there was different periods in art history and in our social history where rituals have become more, you know, were more important and more embraced than others. You know, we were talking about, you know, our grandmothers having certain forks for certain things and certain implements in a morning room versus, you know, a place that you retire to in the evening. And we have slightly lost sense of those rituals of our day, the beginning of the day and the end of the day.
And I suppose one can also think about ritual in a totally secular context as well, even though the jumping off point was religious. There's also a sense that ritual is more about shaping time and shaping experience than it is necessarily about a specific act of worship or a higher power.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's move on, Lucy, if you don't mind, to the next assemblage, which is the forthcoming collection. If you could just quickly go through these last images of assemblage 5. I think it is, by the way, worth saying that a lot of the logic of the assemblages is that the basic forms return. So for example, that low table that people are seeing, that goes all the way back, I think, even to assemblage 1, that elements table.
Yeah, the element table we've done in every single collection, except this new one.
Yeah. So you're kind of bringing the changes on specific forms. And here we see some of these very cool process images of how the glass was made, for example, crystal glass.
Yeah, so with the element table, the play with the volume and the void, the precious and the raw, sometimes the masculine and the feminine, you know, it's been almost, you know, those very simple building blocks were allowed me to play with materials, you know, without having to change the geometry or become too obsessed with geometry. By changing the materiality, I could change the significance or the meaning of the piece.
Right. So here, trumpets blare, because we're now getting to the big reveal of assemblage 6, and I think it's fair to say that in many respects, this assemblage departs radically from everything you have been doing before and everything we've been talking about. So the idea of repeating the same forms in a slightly different inflection, the idea of being very exposed to or open to multiple influences. A lot of that is what you were trying to get away from in this body of work, if I understand it rightly. But maybe you could just sort of start the story with where it started. How did you arrive at making these extraordinary objects that look like full-scale maquettes?
So I started working on this collection and started to sketch. I don't draw, so it's always through model making. But everything that I was creating somehow looked like something else that either I had produced or someone else had produced. And I was just desperate to find a geometry that I felt was truly unique, and a sense of working that could basically take me over the next few years, that was completely not referential of any work that I'd done before. So it was just starting again, like a child would if you presented them with, a roll of sellotape and some cardboard. What would they create? And so I locked myself in the studio with the guys that I work with in the studio, and for weeks and weeks and weeks, we just created maquettes out of things that we had in the studio. So masking tape, sellotape, cardboard, anything that was around, wire, and just created literally hundreds of maquettes. And then at the end of that process, I just lined them all up, covered the rooms with the maquettes, and then started to pull out the ones that spoke to me and that had some kind of had some resonance with me. And so from that, I built a collection of little maquettes that I put on the table and was like, okay, this is the show. And those around me looked at me and was like, okay, well, should we start developing this? And I was like, well, we're not going to develop it. We're literally going to make that. So we have to make that table look like that bit of cardboard, and that light needs to be made so it looks like made out of masking tape. And we've got that challenge, but it has to be permanent and it has to last. And so we created cardboard boxes with masking tape and brown tape out of bronze and paint. And you go up to them and you think that they are cardboard boxes until you touch them, and then they're cold, not warm, and they don't move. They're there.
These are incredibly heavy and obdurate instead of light and fragile, for example, in this case.
Yeah.
So you had this incredible task of transposition from one set of materials to another set of materials. And I suppose that was a very, very sustained research process that also involved a lot of people outside the studio, yes?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been extremely challenging. And in fact, we've had to let go of some of, I cannot get sellotape right. Do you call it?
We call it Scotch tape in America, usually, being more brand oriented.
Well, yeah, sellotape is also. So I haven't managed to get that right. I've tried it in glass and resin, and it's not, we haven't pulled it off. But it's exciting that we have managed to get this far with it. And there've been many manufacturers that have just closed the door on it. But we've got there. Yeah.
So,
what I really, the thing that I am proud of is the fact that we have pushed to manufacturing. Something that started off so effortless and I guess childlike has actually become, seriously refined in terms of manufacturing capabilities.
Yeah, it's interesting because you do reference this idea of intuition or childlike kind of first take, but then the objects themselves have this almost intense level of sophistication built into them, material sophistication, I mean.
That's the irony of it, is that in order to preserve that moment of creation, how do you, normally this would go through, a round of sketches, then you'd put it onto renders, and then you would develop and develop and develop until from maquette to final piece, it would almost be unrecognizable. And for designers to show their maquettes, it's quite personal, it's quite a big reveal. So for me, this collection feels very much like it's about vulnerability. I'm really showing and exposing, a process here, exposing the maquettes at their earliest point. And at the same time, I guess the materials also feel quite fragile until you actually touch them and realize it's bronze.
Do you think that key idea of vulnerability, do you think that came along for you for some reason at this point in your career? Was there a reason that you felt like you needed to kind of have the process standing naked like that?
I don't know, that's hard to answer at this point. I don't know yet. I haven't got far enough back from the collection. I haven't got, far enough back from the work yet. But it does feel like the right time to expose oneself and to be kind of, to accept the vulnerability. You know, we were all pretty vulnerable at this point, I think. But I think, you know, when I was creating the work, it felt, again, it was after having children. So I had my twins 2 years ago, and so, you know, that as a woman, as a mother, you do feel very vulnerable at that point. And so I think there's probably a lot of that energy that went into creating those maquettes.
So it was very personal in that sense.
Personal, yeah.
Although it also responds, at least to my eye, it responds to certain currents out there in the design field and beyond the design field, thinking about social media and its invasiveness into our lives and our consciousness, and the sense that we're kind of all on stage all the time. And so there's even, in a way, a kind of cliche about taking people behind the scenes, you know, like the DVD's director's track.
Yeah.
And I feel like in some ways this collection,
it's all very informed, isn't it? It's all very, I mean, I have to say that, you know, I haven't been to Milan Furniture Fair for maybe 3 years, 2 years definitely, and I haven't, you know, been to many design openings. I literally have kind of locked myself away, and I'm working on this collection as well as my fashion collection. So it has been, the last couple of years have been a time of insular.
Like shutting off the tap of influences because it's too much of a tidal wave.
I don't know how young designers can do it at the moment. You know, when I started, you know, you essentially had your library, you had some magazines that told you about what was going on. You know, some people had a computer. You know, when I was at the magazine, you had one computer in the room that was there for the art department. And now, you know, now just through everything, I find it so disabling, and I feel for young designers to create at this point. It's so disabling to be bombarded by what other people are doing. Maybe they're more resilient or becoming more resilient to it. I don't know, but in order to create, I have to shut down, because otherwise you're too concerned about what the other influences or what other people are thinking. Or, you know.
It makes me think back to the first Design and Dialogue that we had with Misha Khan. And he's responding exactly to the same set of forces that you're describing, but in the opposite direction, because he's created this incredibly polymorphic.
Yes, yeah, his output is very different to mine, but I'm sure
I find it very interesting to see these two bodies of work as responding to some of the same currents out there. But I think for you and this assemblage 6 and the idea of unlearning, there's also, it seems to me, a great degree of emphasis on that original moment of conception and really holding fast to it and treating it as something that's worthy of respect and even a kind of memorialization.
Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah,
so,
that's very, that's a moment of creativity. It's so special.
So is there something there about the DNA of the creative that you wanted to enshrine in the objects, like a specific moment of having come up with something as a kind of basic human faculty, or like what lies behind all the rest of what you do as a designer is that moment of breakthrough or first finding a form?
I think as a designer, that moment where you go, that's it.
Yeah.
It's something, you know, there's something, that's why you do it. It's like a kind of, it's guttural, it's instinctual. It's like, yes, that's, you know, I'm happy with that. That's the magic part. And then, you know, often what comes afterwards, you know, starts to tear away at that. You know, well, you can't do that, or you can't develop that, or, you know, that's not possible. And so I feel that this is the most open way that I can connect at the moment, is to show that very early point of creativity.
Yeah, like that Eureka moment, and then letting it sort of sit there and resonate over the months of development of each piece as well. It's like it keeps echoing or something. Can you talk a little bit about this couch? Because I think maybe for viewers, it immediately looks a little bit different from everything else that they're seeing.
Yeah, obviously in my studio there's a lot of canvas and fabric, and so although it may look different, it's been created in exactly the same way, you know, because in my world there's a lot of textile, and so these were just originally they were just cubes of artist canvas filled with expanding foam.
Mm.
And then just sort of stuck them together, and then it was like, actually, that makes quite a good sofa.
Right.
So yeah, it has come together, although the final piece looks kind of different to the others. The way it came about is in the same way.
It also, to me, has a real painterly quality to it. Like, it makes me think of Franz Klein or other abstract expressionists. And
Yeah.
I guess to me, the surface feels a bit freer, maybe. I mean,
Yeah.
here we're seeing the painting.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just the initial surface was this artist canvas, primed artist canvas that was painted, very loosely in white, and that's what I was working with. So I needed to kind of keep that throughout the final piece. And then with marker pen, the edges were just marked along with marker pen, and then in the final piece with paint.
I guess it prompts the thought that although this might seem initially to be a kind of, I don't know about the word dry, but maybe a very restrictive way of generating objects, because there's such a literalness in terms of the translation of the original maquette to the eventual thing. In fact, there's a huge amount of invention and creativity and experimentation that happens as each object is developed, and they do have very different affect and a very different sensibility to one another, the different pieces in the assemblage, I mean.
Yeah, and I'm not finding it restrictive at this point. I mean, obviously I've only just started, but I feel like I've got, in my archive about, at least 5 years worth of work, because all of these maquettes that still, I'm yet to create. So I'm not finding it limiting.
We're just at the point of wanting to go to Q&A, but maybe the last observation I would make is that there's something very beautiful there about the sense that these maquettes actually do have a generative quality, and they can't, as you say, it feels like almost an endless fountain of possibility coming out of these very, very quick moments, joined to this counterintuitive and ingenious idea of replicating the materials and then replicating the forms at full scale. Just that kind of one magic transformative idea. It allows you to work as a designer in a totally new way. It's like a new lease of life for your studio in a way.
Yes, it does feel like that. I mean, that's what I want. That's what I intended, and that's why I feel, I don't know the response yet and people's response to it, but that's why I feel liberated by it, because I found a new alphabet.
Yeah, totally new language. Well, we now have a chance to get some response, so let's do it. Can we go to Peter Fleming first? And Peter's got a question about the prescience of this body of work. And I have to say, when I first saw it, I thought it was all about Brexit. but just because everything was about Brexit last year. But Peter, can you frame?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously we're all stuck in our little cubicles here, and so the way you're working with this, at least the genesis of this project, was kind of fascinating in respect to how you can actually generate work with essentially nothing, no access to studio, no access to real materials. So I was fascinated by the approach, and when I typed that comment, I was just looking at the maquettes, and then suddenly it transforms into this amazing, collection of again very rarefied materials. So there's a kind of interesting connection there, and Avsar is speaking about it after me, obviously, in a similar context. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that shift in the means of creation.
Thank you. I think in terms of the maquettes, you're absolutely right. I realise that now for my studio working, we're all working within our own environments. We've got a project that we're working on for the end of the year for the Triennale in Australia. And this is now proving to be the best way to work, because we're able to work with that, working on what we're going to be doing for this new show. We're able to work with, no one can get hold of any materials now to make anything. You're probably in that situation too. So the fact that we can start to work with the cardboard and the tape and the wire, you know, in its basic form, is actually is hugely liberating. But at the same time, we have to go through that process, as you remarked, making it into bronze. I will need those manufacturers, you know, to reopen before the end of the year, because I've got to create them. But I think it has felt like a liberating way of working, and it feels like a really liberating, relevant way of working for right now.
I wonder if that may signal the possibility of working with more ephemeral materials on either a larger scale, or, you know, I mean, we may all get to that point when we're living out of cardboard boxes with cardboard furniture. You know, who knows?
Let's hope not.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I think it's liberating, isn't it, to be able to work in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Although I suppose part of the logic of the whole body of work is that it brings together the very informal and rapid and the very, as I said, sophisticated and permanent. So it wouldn't, you couldn't in a way do this idea just in cardboard and tape. The bronze needs to come in, yeah.
Well, that's why I say I need my manufacturers to reopen, because yeah, I can only take it so far, but it needs to go further in order to make the pieces the way that they.
That's where the lightness of gesture requires its gravity field, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, that to have that level of manufacturing too is, you know, it's extraordinary, and it's something that I'm very passionate about.
Mm-hmm. Just in terms of respect for those fabricators and their skills, yeah. Okay, we have a question from Absar, who joined us on Monday, in fact. Welcome back. And this is about, reality and mimicry.
Yeah. Your earlier works are like you're working with the material itself, the real thing, the glass, the earth, and there are almost like the amount of detail is almost non-existent, you know, like it's very smooth, very like all these fillets and roundness and smoothness. But then suddenly you're not only changing the work method, the material itself, like going to cardboard and scotch, I mean the tape and the paper and metal, but you start to like you're working with it, but the end result is actually a kind of replica of it, right? Like you're mimicking the cardboard. And here we see quite in an opposite way that you are, there's this extreme attention to details, like how the cardboard is actually torn off from one side, or we see this wavy inside of the material itself. So like, is there a specific point or some kind of a mark in time that you can say a switch kind of got off and it turned into this, or is it conscious or unconscious?
Honestly not. I mean, maybe it's always with hindsight. I was explaining to Glenn, sometimes you kind of need that distance. I'll probably be able to answer that question a bit better in about 2 years' time. But at the moment, I don't really understand that switch, but I just felt I needed that. And you're absolutely right. You know, before it was so much more about the clean geometry and embracing the material almost with a very simple geometry. But I think maybe with the simplicity of these materials and needing, you know, the photograph of the chair, for example, that looks like paper, again made of bronze, it just doesn't photograph well. You don't see the texture, you don't have that feeling of paper. But when you see it in the flesh, it has that feeling of paper, because it's got all that texture and the tears and the repairs on the maquette and everything like that. So it's very difficult for me to answer why, but it's been, it has been kind of obsessive attention to that level of detail and texture, which I haven't seen probably in my work before yet.
That's a great segue, in fact, to Juliana's question. Juliana Wisdom has a question for us about touch and tactility. Yeah, we can hear you, Juliana. Hi.
I'm really excited about the like imagining how you interact with these new pieces through touch. It's just like thinking about as a maker, making small scale maquettes, it's such a like fingertip interaction. It's all kind of through your fingertips. And with like a full scale piece, we're kind of like, we can sit on some of these and like run our whole palm across them. And I was just kind of curious how that aspect, kind of what you've discovered, or how, if you could describe a little bit about how that interacts with, you know, also like the kind of illusion of the material shift and the scale shift.
Yeah, so the trompe l'oeil effect of it. Yeah, it's I think this is the first collection that I've created where I really feel disappointed in the photography. You know what I mean? Because you actually have to see it, you have to touch it, you have to have contact with it. So I would almost rather like destroy all the pictures of it, ensure that everybody could see it and touch it and sit on it, because you don't get, as you said, the value of it, the importance of it is that tactile quality, and so perhaps with the work that I've created before, you know, would photograph perfectly well. You might not even need to see it to understand it, to appreciate it. But this, you're right, you know, I'm not a maker, but maybe this is the closest I've got to actually revealing my personal touch. And so, yeah, I need people to touch it and experience it in its flesh to understand it, rather than just seeing a photograph of it. But yeah, I think this is probably the closest I've got to being a maker.
You know, there's an ironic thing I would just mention there, Faye, too, which is that there's a way, just that touch is the kind of truth teller when you're engaging with these objects. And this is, I suppose, the whole point of the phrase trompe l'oeil, fool the eye, right?
The eye, the illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I can't play that joke on you unless you go and try and sit on it or touch it. And so a picture of it just doesn't allow me to play that card.
Well, it's just another aspect of the contemporaneity of the body of work to me, because it seems to me like, you know, these much overplayed themes now of fake news and alternative facts and so on, and the sense that we're living in a kind of truth vacuum, and that the way that photography and other reproductive technology is being used to generate these kind of fictional scenarios. So this idea of going back to basics, which is what the project is all about, also has this kind of like high test tactility that, you know, this really, really, really is real, even though it doesn't look like what it is.
Yeah. This is real, I'm real.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of, it's flipping that relationship of falsity and truth around in a way, and you really engage with it at that level when you're actually sitting in that chair. Okay, a question from Walter Mingeldorf. Walter, are you with us? No? Okay, maybe we'll go on to Tarini.
Hey, hi.
Hi, Tarini, how are you?
Hi.
Good, how are you? I just wanted to introduce myself because I attended the last session also, and you're the only person that I know here. Yeah, it was nice to see your work, and I appreciate your process, and I loved what you guys were talking about rituals, about her work being ritualistic. I think that you articulated that really nicely. You said ritual is more about shaping time, and I think for me personally it's related to space also, and that's coming out in your work, I think, with your furniture and, you know, the way that it's placed in the room. I appreciate it. I think there's something also about like for me, I'm a very ritualistic person. I do things on a ritualistic basis, like every day, like waking up, I have to like do certain things at a certain time, or else I just like lose myself. And there's also like, I think the community aspect to that is, I think like ceremony, and maybe that, you know, I'm from India, and I've grown up with that. I've seen that a lot, and I don't know. I haven't seen something similar like that happening in America, and I've been here only for 3 years now. So yeah.
Oh, thank you. Faye, do you think there's something ritualistic about this new body of work as well?
I hadn't thought about it in that way.
Yeah.
Don't know yet.
Maybe we'll find out when it's all in the room together.
Yeah.
Actually, you know, one thing I did want to mention just in relationship to, we might have lost Walter now, but he was asking about scale. And one thing that I did want to let people know is that at least the current plan is for the gallery to actually feel like a tabletop.
Yes.
So can you just explain that? Because that's a big part of how the work will be presented.
Yeah, so we're going to, I'm going to take most of the maquettes that were made originally. So they will be within the space, because I think to understand where they started from and the scale, you know, the scale shift is important. So there will be a presentation of all of the, you know, the maquettes that were made. And then in terms of the way that we're presenting it in the gallery, obviously it's a very clean white space, but it's all going on felt chromat. I don't know if you have that. MDF, coloured MDF plinths, but very low flat plinths on the floor, almost like tabletops essentially. And yeah, it's just wanting to play with that scale, the understanding that it came from originally from a small maquette.
So do you think that there's going to be a kind of Alice in Wonderland, Gulliver's Travels kind of thing happening for people, like they're in the land of the giants, or?
So for some reason, every article ever written about me in German calls me Alice in Wonderland. I am labelled as Alice in Wonderland. I don't know.
That was already the case. You're asking for it now.
I'm really asking for it now. Yeah, I drunk the drink, so.
Drink me, right? Well, that's certainly very suggestive for the cocktails at the opening. Okay, well, I think that's about all we have time for. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. I have to say it's been a great privilege to be able to see this work in advance and have this preview for it. When we finally get to see it in person, I think it'll be very surprising as well, because as you say, there's nothing like seeing it in the.
Yeah, exactly. I need that gag. I need to be able to show you that it, you know, it's
something to really look forward to. Just before signing off, I did want to remind everyone that we have Humberto Campana of Campana Brothers on Friday. So same time, same link, 11 o'clock Eastern time on Friday morning. And then we'll be continuing on with our 3-day per week schedule starting next weekend for the duration of the lockdown, however long we're in it. So thank you so much, Faye, for your time.
Thank you everyone for taking the time. Really
yeah. Thanks to everyone for joining in.